Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. What I'm about to tell you tonight is terrifying. 6 people, 6 December snowstorms. 6 nights in the Appalachian Mountains that changed everything. These workers thought they were alone during the worst blizzards. They were dead wrong. Something was out there in the snow, waiting. Something that only comes out when the storm is so bad nobody can hear you scream. These stories are real. These people barely escaped. Before we start, hit subscribe and smash that like button. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Now, turn off your lights, and whatever you do, don't look outside if you hear something. Let's begin. I was 28 that winter, working the night shift at Harlan's only gas station up on Devil's Creek Road. My name's Danny Walsh, born and raised in these mountains, and I knew every holler and ridgeline between here and Cumberland Gap. My granddaddy used to say the mountains remember everything, every death, every sorrow, every soul that never made it home. I thought it was just old mountain talk until December 23, 2019, when I learned some memories have teeth. The Appalachian Electric Cooperative had been having problems all winter. Rolling blackouts, equipment failures, transformers exploding for no good reason. The company blamed it on aging infrastructure and harsh weather, but the old-timers knew better. They'd whisper about the mine disaster of 1962, when 43 men died in a cave-in up on Laurel Mountain. The mine company had illegally tapped into the power grid to run their equipment, and when the earth shifted, all that electrical current had nowhere to go. Some folks said it went into the mountain itself, into the coal seams and underground streams, waiting. Mrs. Chen owned the mountain stop station where I worked. She was from California originally, moved here when she married a local man who died in a logging accident 5 years back. She didn't understand mountain ways, didn't know why the locals would never work alone during electrical storms, why certain folks refused to touch the gas pumps after dark. She just saw an opportunity to serve truckers and hunters heading into the backcountry. I needed the job. Sarah had left me that fall, took our daughter Emma to live with her sister in Ohio. Said she couldn't handle the isolation anymore, couldn't stand how I'd changed after my tour in Afghanistan. I drank too much, slept too little, and jumped at every unexpected sound. The night shift suited me. Fewer people to deal with, time to think, and the mountains felt safer in the dark somehow. During the day, with all the noise and movement, I'd get overwhelmed. But at night, with just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of wind through the pines, I could almost find peace. The station sat at the intersection of Devil's Creek Road and Highway 421, about 30 miles from the nearest town. It was an old building, built in the 1972 and renovated badly several times since. The electrical system was a patchwork of different installations, original copper wiring, newer aluminum runs, some sections that nobody could quite identify. During inspections, contractors would shake their heads and mutter about code violations, but somehow everything kept working. Mrs. Chen had applied for permits to completely rewire the place, but the county kept finding reasons to delay the project. I'd been working there almost 3 years when the December storms started. The first few were normal winter weather for eastern Kentucky. Ice, wind, power outages that lasted a few hours. But each storm seemed to leave something behind. Equipment would work fine during the day, but malfunction at night. The security cameras would show empty spaces during playback, even when customers had clearly been present. The cash register would ring up items that weren't being purchased, displaying names of products we'd never carried. The other night, shift workers had started calling in sick more frequently. Tommy Mullins, who'd worked nights for 15 years, quit without notice after claiming he'd heard voices coming through the electrical outlets. Lisa Hendricks lasted 1 week before she stopped showing up altogether. When Mrs. Chen called to ask why, Lisa just said the place felt wrong after midnight and hung up. That left me as the only reliable night coverage, which suited Mrs. Chen fine since I never complained and always showed up. She'd increased my pay and given me more responsibilities, handling the cash deposits, managing vendor deliveries, keeping track of inventory. I think she appreciated that I didn't ask questions about the weird incidents other employees reported. Truth was, I'd seen worse things overseas, and a gas station with quirky electrical problems didn't scare me much. December 23rd started normal enough. The day shift girl, Rebecca, warned me about a storm coming in from the west. The weather service was calling for 6 to 8 inches of snow, with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. In the mountains, that kind of weather could turn deadly fast. Roads would become impassable, power lines would come down, and anybody caught away from shelter could freeze to death before morning. I'd stocked up on supplies earlier that week: extra batteries for my flashlight, a sleeping bag in case I got stranded, enough food for several days. The station had a backup generator and a wood-burning stove in the back room that the previous owners had installed. If the power went out, I could keep the place running until help arrived. Rebecca left around 4 p.m., right as the first snowflakes started falling. By 5 p.m., the snow was coming down steadily, accumulating on the roads and making driving treacherous. By 6 p.m., I hadn't seen a customer in over an hour. The scanner on the counter crackled with reports of accidents and road closures. State police were advising everyone to stay home unless travel was absolutely necessary. The first sign something was wrong came around 7 p.m. I was restocking the coffee supplies when I heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy boots, moving slowly, like someone was struggling through deep snow. But when I looked up, the parking lot was empty. No vehicle, no tracks in the snow, nothing. The footsteps continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped right at the front door. I grabbed my coat and went outside to investigate. The snow was falling thick and heavy, limiting visibility to maybe 20 feet. I walked around the entire building, checking for any sign of whoever had been on the porch. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed snow, no indication anyone had been there at all. The only tracks were mine from checking the gas pumps earlier. Back inside, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Could have been ice falling from the roof or settling sounds from the building. Old structures make all kinds of noises during temperature changes. But those footsteps had been too rhythmic, too deliberate to be random building sounds. They'd sounded like someone wearing heavy work boots, the kind coal miners or construction workers wear. Around 8 p.m., the lights flickered for the first time. Not unusual during a storm. Wind could cause power lines to sway, creating momentary interruptions. But these flickers seemed purposeful somehow, like someone was testing the switches. 3 quick blinks, then steady light, then 3 more blinks. The pattern repeated several times before stopping. The heating system started acting strange about the same time. The building would get uncomfortably warm, then suddenly cold enough to see my breath. The thermostat showed a steady 72 degrees. But my skin told a different story. I checked the vents and found them alternating between hot and cold air every few minutes, like something was manually controlling the system. By 9 p.m., the snow was really coming down. I could barely see the gas pumps through the front windows, and the wind was starting to howl through the mountains with that particular sound that always reminded me of screaming. The scanner reported that Highway 421 was now officially closed, and the state police were pulling back to town until the storm passed. That's when I heard the first voice. It came through the PA system, which I hadn't turned on. A man's voice, speaking softly, almost whispering, Danny Walsh, we've been waiting for you." The voice was distorted, like it was coming through old speakers or being transmitted over a poor connection. But underneath the electronic interference, I could hear something familiar. A Kentucky accent, mountain inflection, like someone who'd grown up in these hollers. I checked the PA controls, but everything was switched off. The system shouldn't have been capable of transmitting anything. I unplugged it from the wall, but the voice continued. "You don't remember us, Danny boy, but we remember you. We remember your granddaddy, too." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature fluctuations. My granddaddy had died when I was 12, but he'd worked in the coal mines most of his life. He'd been part of the rescue crew that tried to reach the trapped miners in 1962, the ones who died when their illegal electrical setup caused the cave-in. The voice continued, clearer now. 43 of us went into the dark, Danny. 43 of us never came home. But we didn't stay buried. Oh no, we found the wires. We found the current. We found a way to ride the lightning. I tried to leave then, grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but the electronic lock had engaged. The manual override didn't work. I was trapped inside with whatever was speaking through the dead PA system. "Can't leave yet, boy. Storm's just getting started." And we got so much catching up to do. The lights went out completely, plunging the store into absolute darkness. The only illumination came from the emergency exit signs and the faint glow of the cash register display. In that eerie red light, I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then the electrical outlets began to spark. Not random electrical failures. These were deliberate, controlled discharges. Blue-white arcs of electricity danced out of every outlet, reaching across the room like grasping fingers. They moved with purpose. Searching, hunting, trying to make contact with something. The voice returned, now coming from multiple sources. The dead PA system, the unplugged radio, even the cash register speaker. Electricity remembers, Danny. It carries memory through the wires. Carries pain and anger and the need for justice. If your granddaddy knew. He felt us in the cables when he tried to restore power to the mine. Felt us reaching for him. I understood then. The mine disaster hadn't just killed 43 men. It had somehow trapped their consciousness in the electrical current itself. For 60 years, they'd been riding the power lines through these mountains, growing stronger during storms, waiting for someone connected to their story. The temperature in the store was now shifting violently, freezing one moment, blazing hot the next. Sweat and frost formed on my skin simultaneously. The fluorescent lights flickered back on, but they were wrong somehow. Instead of normal white light, they cast shadows that moved independently, forming shapes that looked almost human. Every electrical device in the store came alive at once. The coffee makers turned on and off rapidly. The lottery machine began printing tickets continuously. The security monitors showed footage that couldn't be real. Images of the store interior, but populated by shadowy figures that shouldn't exist. The voices were getting stronger, more distinct. I could hear individual miners now, each one speaking through a different electrical source. I was 24, left a wife and 2 babies. Crushed by falling rock. Took 3 hours to die. Never got to see my daughter graduate. Company covered it up. Said it was our fault. The gas pumps outside activated simultaneously, dispensing fuel onto the snow-covered ground. But in the strobing light from inside the store, the spilled gasoline looked dark, almost black. The fumes carried an impossible smell, not petroleum, but coal dust and decay, and something metallic that made my nose bleed. I tried to break the windows, but they wouldn't shatter. Tried to force the door, but it held firm. The electronic lock wasn't just engaged, it had been welded shut by electrical current. The metal glowing cherry red around the edges. Your granddaddy tried to help us, came into the mine when others wouldn't. We were grateful. But gratitude fades, Danny. Pain remains, anger grows. The electrical attacks became more focused, more violent. Streams of electricity shot from the outlets, trying to hit me directly. I dodged behind shelving, but the metal racks conducted the current, sending shocks through my body when I touched them. My muscles cramped and spasmed. My vision blurred. The security cameras had turned to track my movement, and now I could see what they were really showing. Not empty shadows, but the faces of dead miners, their features burned and distorted, their eyes glowing with electrical fire. They were in the walls, in the wiring, in every cable and circuit that carried power through the building. We tried to go home, Danny, tried to find peace. But the mountain holds us. The coal dust in our lungs became part of the coal seams. Our blood mixed with the groundwater. Our souls got tangled in the copper and aluminum. We can't leave, so we make others stay. The voices were no longer coming through speakers or electrical devices. They were coming from the air itself, as if the atmosphere had become charged with their consciousness. I could smell ozone and sulfur and the metallic taste of blood. That's when I saw him. Standing behind the counter, translucent but clearly visible, was a man in mining clothes. His face was half collapsed from the cave-in, his coveralls stained with coal dust and blood. He looked exactly like the old photographs of my granddaddy, but wrong somehow. Twisted, corrupted by decades of electrical existence. "Hello, Danny boy. Been waiting to meet you. Your granddaddy talks about you all the time." More figures materialized throughout the store. 43 dead miners, all bearing the terrible injuries that had killed them, all glowing with that sick electrical fire. They moved through the aisles like they owned the place, their feet not quite touching the ground, leaving trails of sparks wherever they passed. This is our store now, our mountain, our territory. We've been collecting the living for years, adding them to our number, teaching them to ride the lightning. I realized then that Mrs. Chen hadn't just bought a gas station. She'd bought a hunting ground. The electrical problems, the employee turnover, the strange incidents, they were all part of a pattern. The miners had been using this place as a trap, luring the living into their electrical domain during storms when their power was strongest. Previous employees didn't quit, Danny. They just changed employment. Behind the dead miners, I could see other figures. Recent additions to their ghostly workforce. Tommy Mullins stood near the coffee station, his face blank and electrical burns covering his neck. Lisa Hendricks floated by the magazine rack, her hair standing on end with static, her eyes completely white. They weren't dead, they were something worse. They'd been converted, their consciousness forcibly integrated into the electrical system. They retained their human awareness but served the miners' agenda, helping to maintain the trap for future victims. Your turn now, Danny. Time to punch in for the permanent night shift. All 45 figures, the original miners plus their new recruits, began moving toward me. The electrical discharges from their bodies created a web of blue-white lightning that filled the store. The temperature shot up to furnace-like levels, then plummeted below freezing. The smell of ozone mixed with coal dust and burning flesh. I backed toward the rear of the store, but there was nowhere to go. The emergency exit was locked, the windows were unbreakable, and the electrical entities were closing in from all sides. Their touch would convert me, add my consciousness to their collective, make me another permanent employee in their supernatural enterprise. But then I remembered something my granddaddy had told me about the mine disaster. The electrical surge that had caused the cave-in had been stopped by flooding. An underground spring had burst through the mine walls, shorting out the illegally installed power lines and ending the electrical fire that had claimed so many lives. Water. The one thing electricity couldn't fully control. I made my way to the back room, fighting through waves of electrical discharge that left my skin smoking and my muscles locked in spasms. The old wood-burning stove was connected to the building's sprinkler system, a safety feature installed after a propane explosion at a similar station 10 years earlier. The override valve was hidden behind a locked panel, but I managed to break it open with a tire iron from the automotive section. When I pulled the handle, water began pouring from ceiling-mounted sprinklers throughout the store. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The electrical entities began screaming, not through speakers or electronic devices, but with voices that came from the very air. Their forms flickered and destabilized as water conducted their electrical essence into the ground. Sparks flew from every outlet and electrical device as their power grid short-circuited. But they weren't destroyed, they were angry. You can't kill us, Danny. We're already dead. We're in the mountain itself. In every power line, every transformer, every electrical device in these hollers. Turn on a light switch, and we're there. Plug in an appliance, and we're watching. You'll never escape us. The sprinkler system finally shorted out from electrical overload, but the damage was done. The building's main power was dead, the backup generator had failed, and emergency lighting was failing system by system. In the growing darkness, I could still see the miners' faces in the last dying sparks from damaged outlets. The front door's electronic lock had finally released. I stumbled outside into the blizzard, my clothes smoking from electrical burns, my vision blurred from repeated shocks. My truck was buried under 2 feet of snow, but the engine turned over on the third try. I drove blind through the storm, following the yellow lines down Devil's Creek Road until I reached the main highway. It took 4 hours to reach the sheriff's office in town, slipping and sliding through snowdrifts and around abandoned vehicles. Nobody believed my story, of course. The sheriff sent a deputy to check on the station, but the roads weren't clear until the next afternoon. By then, they found exactly what they expected: a gas station that had lost power during the storm, with some water damage from a malfunctioning sprinkler system. The security footage showed only empty rooms and normal electrical failures. Mrs. Chen filed an insurance claim and had the place repaired within a month. She hired new employees, but the turnover continued. People would work a few shifts, then quit without explanation. The electrical problems persisted: lights flickering, equipment malfunctioning, voices coming through speakers that weren't turned on. I moved to Virginia after that, found work at a lumber mill in the Shenandoah Valley. Day shifts only. I won't work around electrical equipment, won't live in a house with copper wiring, and I've never spent another night alone during a storm. But sometimes, when I'm driving through mountain country and pass electrical substations or power lines, I can hear them. Faint voices carrying on the current, growing stronger during storms, calling my name from inside the transformers and cable boxes. They're still down there, in the coal seams and underground streams of eastern Kentucky. Riding the electrical grid, waiting for the next person foolish enough to work alone when the lightning comes down. Sarah brought Emma to visit last Christmas. My daughter's 8 now, smart as a whip, curious about everything. When bedtime came and I had to plug in her nightlight, Emma looked up at me and said, "Daddy, why are you afraid of electricity?" I told her it was just something adults worry about sometimes. But as I tucked her in and turned off the overhead light, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A faint voice coming through the electrical outlet next to her bed, so quiet that only someone who knew how to listen would hear it. "Hello, little Emma, your daddy knows us. Maybe someday you'll come visit our mountain." I unplugged everything in the house that night and moved Emma's bed away from the walls. In the morning, I called an electrician to check every outlet, every circuit, every piece of wiring in the place. He found nothing wrong, but I knew they were there, waiting in the electrical system, patient as coal seams, hungry as the mountain darkness. The miners of Laurel Mountain died in 1962, but death didn't stop them from working. They just changed employers. Now they serve a different kind of power company, one that harvests the living instead of coal. And every time someone flips a light switch in the eastern Kentucky mountains, they're one connection closer to completing their eternal shift. Mrs. Chen finally sold the mountain stop station last spring. The new owners are from out-of-state, city folks who don't know the local history. They've hired a full night shift staff and upgraded all the electrical systems. Grand reopening is scheduled for December 23rd. I won't be attending. But if you're ever driving through the mountains during a winter storm, and you see lights flickering in patterns at a lonely gas station, and you hear voices calling from dead speakers, remember this: some employment contracts never expire. And the night shift in those haulers runs a lot longer than 8 hours. It runs forever. I'm 33 now, and I've been working as a school janitor for almost a decade. Started right out of high school when I couldn't afford college. And honestly, it's been a steady gig. Tom Bradley's my name, and I've been the night custodian at Ridgeline Elementary here in West Virginia for 8 years. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and gives me decent benefits. The school sits up on a hill overlooking the valley, about 20 minutes outside Beckley. Most folks don't know this, but the building was constructed in 1979 on the exact spot where the old elementary school used to stand. That original building was torn down after what happened in '78, a school bus accident that killed 15 kids during a Christmas blizzard. The new school was supposed to be a fresh start, a way for the community to move forward. I never gave much thought to any of that history until December 23rd last year. That particular evening was supposed to be routine. School had let out for Christmas break 3 days earlier, and I was pulling overtime to do the deep cleaning we couldn't manage during regular school hours. Strip and wax the floors, clean out the boiler room, check all the windows and doors, that sort of thing. The forecast was calling for snow, but nothing too serious, maybe 3 or 4 inches overnight. I'd done this same holiday routine every year since I started, staying late to make sure everything was perfect for when the kids came back in January. The building felt different when it was completely empty. During school hours, even after the kids went home, there was always someone around. Teachers staying late to grade papers, coaches setting up for practice, maybe the principal finishing paperwork. But during break, it was just me and about 40,000 square feet of empty classrooms and hallways. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the old boiler cycling on and off and the occasional creak as the building settled. I'd gotten used to it over the years, even found it peaceful. No interruptions, no one needing something fixed right away, just me and my work. I started in the kindergarten wing like always, moving classroom by classroom with my cart of supplies. The routine was muscle memory by now. Empty trash cans, vacuum, mop, check the windows, turn off any lights someone had left on. Each room had its own personality, decorated with student artwork and educational posters. Mrs. Henderson's room always smelled like crayons and hand sanitizer. Mr. Garcia kept his room so organized it barely needed cleaning. The music room was my least favorite because of all the instruments that needed to be carefully worked around. By around 7 that evening, the snow had started coming down harder than expected. I could see it piling up on the playground equipment through the cafeteria windows. The radio in the kitchen was playing Christmas songs between weather updates that were sounding increasingly serious. The storm was bigger than anyone had predicted, moving faster and dropping more snow. Roads were already getting slick, and they were telling people to stay put if possible. I called my girlfriend Sarah to let her know I might be here all night. She wasn't thrilled but understood. I'd been stuck at work during bad weather before. The school had a small apartment attached to the maintenance office, where the head custodian sometimes stayed during emergencies. It had a cot, a mini fridge, and a bathroom. Not comfortable, but livable if needed. Around 9 o'clock, while I was replacing burned-out fluorescent bulbs in the third-grade hallway, I heard something that made me stop and listen. It sounded like children laughing, not unusual, except the school was completely empty. I stood still for a long moment, but the sound didn't repeat. Old buildings make weird noises, especially during weather changes. The heating system could create sounds that almost seemed like voices if you weren't paying attention. I went back to work, but 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. Definitely children's voices, maybe 3 or 4 kids, coming from somewhere near the library. I walked down there with my flashlight, checking each classroom. Every door was locked, every room dark and empty, just like I'd left them. The library was secure too, motion sensors, dark, everything in place. That's when I found the first classroom, with the desks rearranged. Mrs. Patterson's second-grade room, which I'd cleaned and organized just 2 hours earlier, now had all the student desks pushed into a circle in the center of the room. The chairs were pulled out like kids had just gotten up to leave. On the whiteboard, in what looked like a child's handwriting, someone had written, "The 23rd of December, 1978, Christmas party." I stared at that board for a full minute, trying to make sense of it. The door had been locked. I was the only person in the building. The handwriting was too high on the board for a child to reach, but too shaky and imprecise to be an adult's. The marker was still sitting in the tray beneath the board, cap off, like someone had just finished writing. I erased the message and pushed the desks back into their proper rows, telling myself one of the teachers must have set this up as some kind of joke before leaving for break. Maybe they'd arranged it to look like kids had moved the furniture, though I couldn't figure out why anyone would do that or how they'd gotten back into the building. As I worked my way through more classrooms over the next hour, I kept finding similar things. In Mr. Thompson's fourth-grade room, there were papers scattered on the floor that hadn't been there before. Old worksheets with problems like, "If Johnny has 12 candy canes and gives 3 to his sister," written in faded pencil. The papers looked decades old, yellowed and brittle. In the art room, I found children's winter coats hanging on hooks that I knew had been empty. Small coats and styles from years ago, puffy jackets and snow pants that looked like they belonged in old family photos. When I touched one, it was cold enough to make my fingers ache, like it had been left outside in the snow. The school's bell system rang at 10:30 p.m., playing the melody that signaled the end of recess. The bells hadn't worked properly in years and were supposed to be disconnected during break anyway. But there it was, clear as day, echoing through every hallway. After the melody finished, I could swear I heard the sound of children's feet running in the corridors above me, even though I was on the second floor and there was nothing above but the roof. I tried to call the district maintenance supervisor, but my cell phone wasn't getting signal. The landlines in the building were dead too, probably the storm knocking out phone service. The radio was still working, barely, through heavy static. Between bursts of white noise, I caught fragments of a weather bulletin saying roads were impassable and emergency crews were dealing with multiple accidents. That's when I started hearing the school bus. It was faint at first, almost buried in the sound of wind and snow against the windows, but unmistakably, it was the rumble of a diesel engine and the squeak of brakes that needed maintenance. I looked out every window I could find that faced the parking lot, but there was nothing there except snow piling up around my pickup truck. The engine sound got closer, and I heard the pneumatic hiss of a bus door opening. Then, children's voices, excited and happy, talking about going home for Christmas. Mrs. Davis said we might get the whole week off if it keeps snowing. I hope my mom made cookies. Do you think Santa knows where we live if we move? I ran to the front entrance and threw open the doors. The cold hit me like a physical blow, snow swirling in the wind, but the parking lot was empty. Just my truck and about 8 inches of fresh snow with no tire tracks anywhere. But I could still hear the bus idling somewhere close by, and children chattering as they found seats. Adult voice, the driver, I assumed, calling out, "Everybody buckled up back there. We're gonna take this nice and slow tonight. Roads are getting slippery." I stepped outside in just my work clothes, squinting through the snow, following the sound. It seemed to be coming from the back of the building, near where the old playground equipment was stored. As I walked around the corner, the voices got clearer. I could make out individual conversations now. "I can't wait to see if my grandma sent a present this year. My dad said he might take us sledding tomorrow if the snow sticks." Mrs. Thompson said, "We're going to read a news story when we get back from break." But there was still nothing there, just snow and wind and the old jungle gym covered in white. I was starting to think I was losing my mind when I saw the first child. She was maybe 7 years old, wearing a thick winter coat that looked like it came from the late 70s, bright yellow with fake fur around the hood. She was standing by the swing set, looking confused, like she was lost. When she saw me, she walked over without any fear. "Mister, do you know when the bus is coming? We were supposed to go home already." I knelt down to her level, my heart hammering. She looked solid, real, except that I could see my breath in the cold air, but not hers. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lucy Morrison. I'm in Mrs. Davis's class. We had our Christmas party today, and now we're supposed to go home, but I can't find the bus." Mrs. Davis. I'd heard that name before, but couldn't place where. "Lucy, what year is it?" She gave me the look kids give adults when they ask obvious questions. 1978. Why? More children started appearing around the playground. A boy with thick glasses and a hand-knitted scarf. Twin girls in matching snowsuits. A tall kid who looked like he might be in 5th or 6th grade. All dressed in clothes that were decades out of date. All looking around with the same confused expression. "The bus was right here," the tall boy said. "Mr. Peterson told us to wait by the swings, and he'd be right back." Mr. Peterson. I knew I'd heard that name too, but my brain felt like it was moving through thick fog. One of the twin girls tugged on my jacket. "Mister, it's really cold out here. Can we wait inside?" I looked at these children. 15 of them now, I counted quickly, and made a decision that probably wasn't rational. "Yeah, let's get you all inside where it's warm." They followed me back to the building like I was their teacher, chattering about the Christmas party they'd just had and what they hoped Santa would bring. Inside the bright hallway lights, they looked even more real. I could hear their snow boots squeaking on the floor and see the melting snow dripping from their coats. But something was wrong with the building itself now. The hallways looked different, older somehow. The paint on the walls was a different color, more faded. The trophy case held awards from the 1972nd instead of recent years. Photos of past graduating classes showed styles and haircuts from decades ago. I led them to the library and told them to sit while I tried to figure out what to do. They settled into the reading area, some of them pulling books from shelves, others just talking quietly among themselves. Normal kid behavior, except these children had been dead for over 40 years. While they were occupied, I slipped into the main office to look for the emergency contact information. In the principal's desk, instead of current files, I found records from 1978, class rosters, attendance sheets, and there it was, a folder marked December 23, 1978. Bus route emergency. The file contained everything: weather reports warning of an unexpected blizzard, a memo from the district about early dismissal procedures, and a list of 15 students who were supposed to ride bus #47 driven by Robert Peterson on the day the storm hit. Lucy Morrison, age 7. The Morrison twins, Sarah and Rebecca, age 6. Michael Chen, age 8. Every name matched a child currently sitting in my library. At the bottom of the file was a newspaper clipping. 15 children die in school bus accident. The article described how bus #47 had slid off Pinery Ridge Road during whiteout conditions, rolling down a steep embankment, no survivors. The driver, Robert Peterson, had also died. I looked up from the file to find one of the children standing in the office doorway. Michael, the boy with glasses. "Mr. Bradley, we're getting worried about the bus. Our parents are going to be really mad if we're late for supper." He knew my name, I'd never told him my name. Michael, how do you know who I am? You're the janitor. You've worked here for 8 years. He said it, matter-of-factly, like it was obvious. We've been watching you work. You're nice to us. You've been? Watching me? Every year when the snow comes like this, we come back to wait for our bus. But Mr. Peterson never shows up, and we can't find our way home. We get scared and cold, so we come inside the school where it's warm. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made my skin crawl. Michael, what happens after you come inside? We wait until morning, and then we disappear. And then we forget everything until the next time it snows like this on December 23rd. I walked back to the library with him, looking at these children with new eyes. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were more like echoes, replaying the same night over and over, trapped in a loop they didn't understand. Lucy looked up at me with trusting eyes. Did you find out about the bus? I knelt down in front of her. Lucy, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully, okay? She nodded. You and your friends. You're not waiting for the bus anymore. The bus came a long time ago. What do you mean? I mean, you all went home. This was a long time ago, and you're safe now. You don't have to keep waiting. The confusion in her face broke my heart, but I continued. It's 2024 now, Lucy. You've been grown up for a long time. You don't need to stay here and wait anymore. One by one, understanding dawned on their faces. Not the full comprehension that adults might have, but a child's version of acceptance. They looked around at each other, and some of them started to smile. So we can really go home? Asked one of the twins. You can really go home. Will our moms and dads be there? I thought about that question, about parents who would be elderly now if they were still alive, about homes that had probably been torn down or sold decades ago. But these were children, and children needed different truths. Yes, I said, they'll be there. As soon as I said it, I could hear the bus again. But this time it sounded different, warmer somehow, less mechanical, and more like a promise. The children heard it too, and started putting on their coats. That's Mr. Peterson, Michael said excitedly. He came back. They lined up at the door like they'd been taught, helping each other with zippers and mittens. Lucy was the last one in line, and she turned to look at me before leaving. Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Will you be okay here by yourself? I'll be fine, sweetheart. Maybe next year you could come have Christmas with us. Before I could respond, they were gone, all of them, walking out into the snow toward a bus I still couldn't see but could definitely hear. The door closed behind them with the same pneumatic hiss I'd heard earlier, and the engine rumbled as it pulled away. I stood in the empty hallway, listening to the sound fade into the distance. When I looked around, the building had returned to normal. The walls were painted in the current colors again, the trophy case held recent awards, and everything was exactly as it should be in 2024. The storm ended around dawn. By the time the roads were cleared enough for me to drive home, there was no evidence that anything unusual had happened. The classrooms were clean, the desks in proper order, no old papers or vintage coats anywhere to be found. I never reported what happened that night, who would believe it? But I did some research when I got home. I found the memorial plaque that had been installed at the cemetery where the children were buried, and I visited it a few days later. 15 small headstones, all with the same date, the 23rd of December, 1978. I'm still working at Ridgeline Elementary, still pulling the same holiday overtime every year. But now when December 23rd rolls around and the weather forecast calls for snow, I make sure to stay late. Not because I expect to see those children again. I think they're finally at peace. But because if there are other lost souls wandering these halls, other people who need someone to help them find their way home, I want to be here. Sometimes, the most important part of our job isn't the work we're paid to do. Sometimes, it's just being present when someone needs us, even if we don't understand why or how. Looking back now, I realize those children had been trying to go home for over 40 years. All they needed was someone to tell them it was okay to leave, that they didn't have to keep waiting. I'm glad I was there that night. I'm glad I could help them find their way to whatever comes next. And on snowy December evenings, when I'm alone in the building, I sometimes think I can still hear distant laughter in the hallways. But it's peaceful now, joyful, not lost anymore, just remembering what it felt like to be young and excited about Christmas and going home to the people who loved them. I'm Lisa Park, and I was 29 when I learned that some debts can't be paid, no matter how much you want to help. 3 years ago, I lost my husband Michael in a car accident on Christmas Eve. He was coming home from his shift at the paper mill when black ice sent his truck into Copper Creek. They didn't find him until January 2nd. Ever since, I've been running from Christmas, working jobs that keep me busy during the holidays, staying away from family gatherings, anything to avoid the memories. That's how I ended up taking the overnight shift at Mountain View Grocery in December 2019. It was the only store serving 3 small communities deep in the North Carolina mountains: Millfield, Cedar Ridge, and Hawks Nest. The pay was decent, and more importantly, working Christmas Eve meant I wouldn't have to sit alone in my apartment thinking about what I'd lost. The store manager, Jim Hutchins, had warned me that mountain storms could be unpredictable, but after losing Michael, I wasn't afraid of a little snow. What I should have been afraid of was what the snow brings with it. The building itself was from the 1,960 concrete floors, fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, and a heating system that struggled on the coldest nights. Jim had mentioned that the store was built on the site of an old trading post that burned down in the early 1950s, but he didn't know much more about the history. The locals didn't talk much about the old days, especially the older folks. There was something about the way they'd change the subject whenever the conversation drifted toward the 1950s that should have been a warning. I'd been working there about 6 weeks when December 24th arrived. The forecast called for 4 to 6 inches. Nothing too serious. But by 10 p.m. the flakes were already falling thick and heavy. Jim left early to get home to his family, reminding me to close up if it got bad. "Use your judgment," he said. "Nobody should be out in weather like this, especially on Christmas Eve." The first few hours were normal enough. A handful of last-minute shoppers, mostly folks grabbing milk or bread before the storm hit. The power flickered a few times around midnight, but the emergency generator kicked in without any problems. I was restocking the canned goods when the temperature started dropping inside the store. Not gradually, suddenly, like someone had opened a freezer door. That's when I noticed my breath was visible. I checked the thermostat. It read 68 degrees, same as always, but I could see white puffs coming from my mouth with every breath. I figured the heating system was struggling with the storm and made a mental note to tell Jim about it after Christmas. But when I walked toward the back of the store to check the utility room, the temperature dropped even more. By the time I reached aisle 7, it felt like I was standing in a walk-in freezer. The freezer that wasn't running. I could hear voices, multiple conversations happening at once, but when I looked around, the store was empty. The voices were coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls like they were traveling down a long tunnel. I caught fragments. "Need more butter for the rolls. Make sure we get enough coal for the stove. Children are waiting at Pete. Home." But the words sounded wrong, muffled, like they were coming from underwater or from very far away. The lights started flickering in a pattern. Not random power surges, but deliberate, like Morse code. The fluorescent bulbs would dim to almost nothing, then flare bright enough to hurt my eyes, then settle into this pale, yellowish glow that made everything look sepia-toned, like an old photograph. That's when the first customer walked in. The door chimes played their usual electronic melody, but underneath it, I heard something else. The heavy wooden creak of an old door, the kind with real hinges and a brass bell. An elderly man stood just inside the entrance, stamping snow off boots that looked like they belonged in a museum. His coat was heavy wool with a style I'd never seen outside of old movies. Big buttons, wide lapels, a collar that sat high on his neck. "Evening, miss," he said, and his voice had that same distant, underwater quality I'd heard in the whispers. "Hi there," I managed. "Storm's getting pretty bad out there." He looked confused for a moment, glancing back toward the door like he'd forgotten where he was. "Storm? Yes, I suppose it is. Came down faster than expected." He spoke carefully, formally, like English wasn't his first language, except his accent was pure Appalachian Mountain. I watched him walk toward the back of the store, and his footsteps made no sound on the concrete floor, none at all. When he passed under the fluorescent lights, they flickered and dimmed, casting shadows that moved independently of his body. A few minutes later, I heard him at the self-checkout, which was impossible because we didn't have self-checkout. When I looked over, he was standing at a wooden counter that definitely hadn't been there before. dark wood with brass fittings and an old mechanical cash register, the kind with big round keys and a bell that rang when the drawer opened. He had a basket full of groceries, but they weren't products we carried. The brands were wrong, the packaging was wrong, even the sizes were wrong. Everything looked like it came from decades ago. Canned goods with simple labels, boxes of cereal with fonts I'd never seen, milk bottles instead of cartons. "Find everything you need?" I asked, walking over to help him. "Oh yes, fine selection," he said, though the prices seem different. Higher than I remember. I looked at the items as he set them on the counter. A can of cranberry sauce rang up as $2.49 on the register, but the price tag on the can said 29 cents. Everything was like that, modern prices for products that looked like antiques. He paid with money that looked old, bills with different designs, coins with dates from the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds. But when I held them up to check for counterfeits, they felt wrong. Too light, too cold, and they seemed to fade around the edges like they were dissolving. "Have a blessed Christmas," he said, taking his bags. "You too," I said, but he was already walking away. I watched him head toward the door, and as he reached for the handle, he just kept walking. Straight through the glass, through the metal frame, through the wall itself. The door never opened, the chimes never rang. He simply walked through solid matter like it wasn't there, disappearing into the swirling snow. I stood there, staring at the door for maybe 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. When I looked down at the register, there was no record of the transaction. The drawer showed the same amount of money we'd started with, but I could still smell something, not cologne or aftershave, but something older. Coal smoke. Wood fire. The smell of a house heated by burning things instead of electricity. That's when more customers started arriving. The door kept chiming, but I never saw it open. People just appeared inside the store. Families, couples, individuals, all dressed in clothes that belonged in old photographs. Men in wool coats and fedora hats, women in dresses and stockings despite the snow, children in little coats with too big buttons. They moved through the aisles quietly, purposefully, like they knew exactly what they were looking for. But they cast no reflections in the store windows. Their footsteps made no sound, and wherever they walked, the temperature dropped until I could see my breath in thick white clouds. I tried to help them, tried to treat them like normal customers, but every interaction was wrong. They'd ask for products we didn't carry, brands that didn't exist, items packaged in ways I'd never seen. When I'd show them what we had instead, they'd look confused and frustrated, like I was deliberately misunderstanding them. A woman with 2 small children spent 20 minutes looking for something called ribbon candy in glass jars. When I showed her our candy section, rows of modern chocolate bars and gum and mints, she shook her head sadly. "The children have been so good this year," she said. "They're expecting their Christmas candy." But when she finally picked out some regular candy canes, by the time she got to the checkout, they'd transformed into those old-fashioned glass jars filled with striped hard candy. The price tag said 15 cents, but our register rang them up at $4.99. She paid with coins that looked like silver dollars but felt like ice. The worst part was watching their faces when the register totals came up. These people expected to pay 1,950 seconds prices for their groceries, 25 cents for bread, 50 cents for milk, $3 for enough food to feed a family for a week. When they saw modern prices, they looked panicked, desperate. They'd dig through wallets and purses, counting and recounting money that was 70 years out of date, trying to figure out how to pay for groceries they couldn't afford in a time they didn't understand. By 2 a.m., there were maybe 15 people in the store, all shopping with this focused intensity like they were racing against time. The conversations I could overhear were about Christmas dinner preparations, family gatherings, getting home before the children woke up. But they talked about people who had to be long dead, made plans for celebrations that had happened decades ago. The store itself was changing around them. The modern shelving units flickered and wavered, sometimes appearing as older wooden shelves with handwritten price tags. The fluorescent lights dimmed to the warm yellow glow of incandescent bulbs. The electronic cash registers became mechanical ones with brass fittings and physical keys. Even the products on the shelves shifted. Modern packaging would blur and reshape into vintage designs. Contemporary brands would fade and be replaced by names I didn't recognize. I was standing behind the counter, watching this impossible scene unfold, when a young man approached with a cart full of Christmas dinner ingredients. He looked maybe mid-20s, wearing a heavy coat and wool hat, with that same formal way of speaking I'd heard from all the other customers. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "I'm having trouble with the prices. Everything seems to cost so much more than it should." I looked at his cart: turkey, potatoes, vegetables, cranberry sauce, all the fixings for a big family meal. On our modern register, it came to $127.43, but he was holding maybe $10 in old bills and some change. "I don't understand," he said, real distress in his voice. "This should be enough, more than enough. We saved up special for Christmas dinner. My wife, she's been planning this for weeks. The whole family's coming, my parents, my brothers and their wives, all the grandchildren. They're all waiting for me to get home." That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. His coat was torn across the chest, and through the tears I could see what looked like dark stains. Not exactly blood, too dark for that, too old, but something that had once been red. His face was pale, almost blue around the lips, like he'd been out in the cold too long. "When are you supposed to be home?" I asked quietly. "Tonight," he said. "Christmas Eve. We always have Christmas Eve dinner together, the whole family. My wife's making her apple pie. My mother's bringing her famous rolls. The children are so excited. We've never missed Christmas Eve dinner. Never." "What year?" I whispered. He looked confused. "What year?" "Why, it's 1952, of course. December 24th. 1952. He glanced around the store, taking in the modern equipment, the contemporary products. "Though this place looks different than I remember." That's when it hit me. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for local history. December 1952. The results made my hands shake. December 24th, 1952. A massive avalanche had hit the valley during a sudden blizzard. The snow had been falling heavily all day, but around midnight, the temperature dropped rapidly and the wind picked up. A section of the mountainside above the valley had given way, sending tons of snow, ice, and debris crashing down onto the road that connected the three mountain communities. 47 people had been killed. Entire families who had been out doing last-minute Christmas shopping, trying to get home for Christmas Eve dinner. Their cars had been buried under 30 feet of snow and ice. Some of the bodies weren't found until the spring thaw, and a few were never recovered at all. The avalanche had also destroyed several buildings in the valley, including an old trading post that had served as the area's main general store. The same spot where Mountain View Grocery now stood. I looked up from my phone, and all the customers in the store were staring at me. Not angry, not threatening, just waiting. Like they knew I'd figured something out and were hoping I could explain it to them. "You can't go home," I said, my voice barely working. You're not alive anymore." The young man with the Christmas groceries looked down at his torn coat, touched the dark stains with fingers that I now realized were too pale, too still. Around the store, other customers began examining themselves, noticing tears in their clothes, dark stains, the unnatural pallor of their skin. "How long?" asked an elderly woman holding a small child's hand. 67 years, I said. The silence that followed was the most terrible sound I've ever heard. Not empty silence, but the weight of understanding. The crushing realization of time lost, families missed, celebrations that would never happen. The child the woman was holding began to cry, not the normal crying of a frustrated toddler, but something deeper, a sound of loss and longing that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human experience. Other children throughout the store joined in, and then the adults, until the entire building was filled with a grief so profound it felt like it would collapse the walls. "But we have to get home," the young man said desperately. "They're waiting for us. The dinner is planned. The children are expecting their presents. We promised we'd be there." "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I know you did." That's when I understood why they were here, why they kept appearing in the store on snowy Christmas Eves. They died trying to get home for Christmas, died with their shopping unfinished and their promises unkept. For 67 years, they'd been trying to complete that final task, to buy the groceries they needed and get home to families who were also long dead. But every time they tried, the modern world got in the way. The prices they couldn't afford, the products they didn't recognize, the reality that too much time had passed and they no longer belonged anywhere. I made a decision that probably doesn't make sense to anyone else, but made perfect sense to me. I thought about Michael, about how he'd died trying to get home to me for Christmas. I thought about all the unfinished business between us, all the things we'd never said, all the promises that would never be kept. "Let me help you," I said. I started ringing up groceries at the prices they expected to pay. I took their old money and put it in the register. I found ways to make the modern products work for them, turning regular candy canes into old-fashioned ribbon candy, making sure the turkey was the right size for each family, helping them find everything they needed for their Christmas celebrations. For each family, I created a receipt that showed 1,952 prices and 1,952 dates. I packed their groceries in brown paper bags, the way stores used to do it. I treated them like valued customers who deserved to have their Christmas shopping completed properly. But as I helped them, I started to understand the real horror of their situation. These weren't just lost souls looking for peace. They were people trapped in an endless loop of need and frustration, doomed to shop forever for Christmas dinners they could never eat, to buy presents for children who would never open them, to return again and again to this place where they died, trying desperately to complete the one task that had been left unfinished. And I realized that by helping them, I wasn't setting them free. I was becoming part of the loop. The young man was the last customer I helped. As I handed him his receipt and his bags of groceries, he smiled with genuine relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "Now I can go home. My wife will be so happy. The children will have their Christmas after all." But instead of leaving, he just stood there, holding his groceries, looking toward the door with confusion. "I should go," he said. "They're waiting for me." But I can't remember how to get there. That's when I understood the true horror. They couldn't leave because there was nowhere to go. Their homes were gone, their families were dead, their Christmas dinners would never be eaten. They were trapped not just by unfinished business, but by the impossible nature of their situation. They needed to go home, but home no longer existed. The store began to fill with more customers, dozens of them, then hundreds. Every person who had died in that avalanche, plus others from different years, different storms, all the people who had died trying to get home for Christmas in these mountains over the decades. They kept shopping, kept buying groceries for celebrations that couldn't happen, kept asking me to help them find their way home to places that had been erased from the world. And I realized that I couldn't leave either, because someone had to help them. Someone had to take their money and pack their groceries and send them on their way, even if their way led nowhere. I was part of the system now, the final piece that made their endless shopping possible. The snow outside kept falling, and more customers kept arriving. They would shop until the end of time, buying groceries for Christmas dinners that would never happen, and I would help them because that's what they needed, and because there was no longer any way for me to leave. When Jim found me 3 days later, I was still at the register, still ringing up groceries for customers he couldn't see. The doctor said it was hypothermia and hallucinations brought on by the cold, but I know better. I know I spent those 3 days helping the dead complete their Christmas shopping, and I know that somewhere in those mountains, they're still trying to find their way home. They transferred me to the day shift after that, and I eventually moved to a different store altogether. But every December 24th, when the snow starts falling heavy in the mountains, I get a call from Mountain View Grocery. Not from Jim or any of the other employees, but from someone asking if I can come in and work the overnight shift. The voice is always different, but the message is always the same. We need help with the Christmas shoppers. I don't answer those calls anymore, because I know that if I go back, if I help them one more time, I'll never leave that store again. I'll become a permanent part of their endless Christmas Eve, ringing up groceries for the dead until I join them in their impossible quest to get home. Some debts can't be paid, no matter how much you want to help, and some Christmas shopping trips never end. I'm 34 now, and I haven't worked in healthcare for 7 years. People ask why I left nursing after spending so much on school, why I threw away a stable career to sell insurance in a strip mall office. I tell them I got burned out, that the hours were too hard. But that's not the truth. The truth is what happened during the Christmas Eve storm at Mercy Mountain Hospital, back when I was 27, and still believed that medicine could fix anything. Back when I thought the worst thing about night shifts was missing sleep and dealing with drunk drivers who wrapped their cars around trees. I was Beth Martinez then, not Beth Taylor like I am now. I changed my name after what happened, moved 3 states away from those mountains. But some nights, when the snow starts falling heavy and the wind picks up, I can still smell that metallic scent mixed with wet earth. I can still hear those impossible heartbeats echoing through the ICU. My therapist says I should write it down, says it might help with the nightmares. But how do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you make someone understand that there are things older than hospitals, older than medicine, that have learned to use our compassion against us? I guess I'll start with what happened that night and let you decide for yourself. Mercy Mountain Hospital sat 43 miles from the nearest city, carved into the Virginia Blue Ridge like a concrete tumor. It served 13 rural communities scattered through hollows and ridges that most people couldn't find on a map. The building was old but solid, built in 1973 when coal money still flowed through the region like water. By the time I started working there, most of the mines were closed, the money gone, but the hospital stayed open because people still got sick, still had accidents, still needed somewhere to die with dignity. I'd been working nights in the ICU for 3 years, ever since graduating from nursing school with $43,000 in debt and a desperate need for the night shift differential pay. My student loans were like a weight around my neck, and night work paid an extra $2 an hour. Doesn't sound like much, but when you're counting every penny, it might as well be gold. The other nurses thought I was crazy for volunteering for every holiday shift, but the truth was I had nowhere else to be. My parents lived in Georgia, my ex-boyfriend had moved to Richmond, and my few friends from nursing school were scattered across the state. Christmas Eve meant time and a half pay, and a quiet shift since most people tried to stay home and out of trouble. But December 2018 was different. The Weather Service had been tracking a massive winter storm for a week, something they were calling a once-in-a-generation blizzard. The kind of storm that shut down interstates and left entire counties without power. By December 23rd, they were predicting 2 to 3 feet of snow with 60-mile-per-hour winds. Most of the day shift nurses were panicking about getting home to their families before the roads became impassable. Linda Morrison, the charge nurse, was practically running laps around the unit checking on preparations. "We might be stuck here for 2 or 3 days," she told me as I arrived for my shift at 7 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Administration has set up sleeping quarters in the conference rooms and ordered enough food for a week. I nodded and took the report. 6 patients in the ICU, all stable. Mr. Henderson, 68, recovering from a massive heart attack 3 days earlier. Mrs. Petty, 73, with pneumonia that was responding well to antibiotics. 2 post-surgical patients, both doing fine. An elderly woman with diabetes complications who was scheduled to go home the next day. And Mrs. Chen, 45, recovering from a car accident the week before. "Should be a quiet night," Linda said, but she looked nervous. "Dr. Reeves is staying overnight, and Jerry's on security. The ER has 2 nurses, and we've got 3 EMTs sleeping in the break room just in case." By the time Linda left, the snow was already falling in thick, wet flakes that stuck to the windows and made the parking lot look like a cotton field. I could hear the wind starting to pick up, whistling around the building in a way that made the old structure creak and settle. I made my first rounds at 8, checking vitals, adjusting medications, charting notes. Mr. Henderson was awake and alert, his color much better than when he'd arrived. "Nurse?" he called as I checked his IV. "My wife, she couldn't make it up here before the roads got bad. You'll call me if..." "I'll call you if anything changes," I promised. "But you're doing great. Heart rhythm is steady, blood pressure is good. You'll probably go to a regular room tomorrow." He smiled, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Not fear of dying, but fear of dying alone, of his wife not being able to reach him if something happened. It was a fear I saw often in the mountains, where distance could mean the difference between saying goodbye and having a body to bury. The power flickered at 9:30, and I heard the backup generators testing themselves in the basement, standard procedure during severe weather. The hospital could run on backup power for a week if necessary, though the lighting would be dimmer and some of the non-essential equipment would be shut down. At 10:15, the main power failed completely. The fluorescent lights died and the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an amber glow that made the ICU feel smaller, more isolated. I called down to Jerry to confirm everything was secure. "Roads are already impassable," he told me. "State police have closed the interstate. We're on our own until this thing blows through." I was checking on Mrs. Chen when I heard it, the distinctive wail of an ambulance siren, growing louder despite the howling wind. I looked out the window but couldn't see anything through the snow and darkness. The sound grew closer, then stopped abruptly. My phone rang 2 minutes later. Jerry's voice was tight with confusion. "Beth, you're not going to believe this, but there's an ambulance in the parking lot. No idea how they made it through this weather." The elevator doors opened 5 minutes later, and 2 paramedics wheeled in a patient on a stretcher. Both EMTs were covered in snow and ice, their uniforms soaked through. I didn't recognize either of them, which was strange because I knew most of the paramedics in the region. "Hypothermic exposure," said the older one, a thin man with pale eyes and snow in his graying beard. "Found him in his car about 15 miles out. Vehicle went off the road, probably been there 6 to 8 hours. They transferred the patient to bed 7, the only empty bed in the unit. He appeared to be in his 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that were frozen stiff. His skin was gray-white, like old newspaper, and cold as ice even through my examination gloves. I started the rewarming protocol immediately, heated blankets, warm IV saline, external heating pads. But when I took his temperature, the thermometer showed 58 degrees Fahrenheit. I stared at the readout, certain it was wrong. Nobody survived core body temperatures that low, not for hours. I tried a different thermometer. Same reading. I tried the digital rectal thermometer, 56 degrees. "Are you sure about the timeline?" I asked the paramedics as they prepared to leave. "How long was he exposed?" The thin one, with pale eyes, looked at me strangely. "Hard to say in weather like this. Could have been 8 hours, could have been 12. Car was buried pretty deep." "How did you even find him? And how did you make it through the roads?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We know these mountains pretty well, been working them for a long time." After they left, I tried to focus on the new patient, but nothing about him made medical sense. His heart rate was 18 beats per minute. His respiratory rate was 4 breaths per minute. By every measure I'd been taught, he should have been dead. But the monitors showed electrical activity, and when I put my stethoscope to his chest, I could hear his heart beating a slow, irregular rhythm, unlike anything I'd ever heard. His hands were the first thing that really disturbed me. The frostbite damage should have been severe, black, necrotic tissue that would require amputation. Instead, his fingers looked pale but healthy, with what appeared to be new pink skin growing over areas that should have been dead. As I watched, I could swear the damaged tissue was healing visibly, new cells replacing dead ones in real time. But it was his proportions that made my skin crawl. His arms seemed too long for his torso, reaching almost to his knees even when lying flat. His fingers were elongated, with too many joints, and his wrists bent at angles that didn't look human. When I tried to position his arm for an IV, the bones felt wrong underneath the skin, like they were hinged in places they shouldn't be. His face looked peaceful, almost serene, but something about the bone structure bothered me. His jaw was too wide, his forehead too prominent, his eye sockets too deep. And though his eyes were closed, I had the unsettling feeling that he was watching me. A couple of times I thought I saw his eyelids flutter, but when I looked directly at him, he seemed completely unconscious. The smell started around midnight. At first it was just a faint metallic odor around bed 7, like old pennies or blood, but it grew stronger over the next hour, mixing with something that reminded me of wet earth after rain. The smell of fresh graves. I checked all the medical equipment for leaks or malfunctions, but everything appeared normal. By 1 a.m., my other patients were becoming agitated. Mr. Henderson, who had been sleeping peacefully, started muttering in his sleep and tossing restlessly. His monitor showed an elevated heart rate and blood pressure. Mrs. Petty's oxygen saturation began to drop, despite the fact that her pneumonia had been improving steadily. But it was Mrs. Chen who really scared me. She'd been stable for days, her injuries from the car accident healing normally, but suddenly she was developing new symptoms that exactly matched the supposed hypothermia patient in bed 7. Her skin became pale and cold, her heart rate slowed to an abnormal rhythm. Her body temperature started dropping, despite the heated blankets. I checked the man in bed 7 again. His core temperature had risen to 72 degrees, still impossibly low, but somehow stable. And I noticed something that made my stomach turn. He had developed new injuries that perfectly mirrored Mrs. Chen's car accident trauma. A bruise on his forehead that matched hers exactly. Scratches on his arms in the same pattern. Abrasions that looked identical, down to the smallest detail. He was copying her injuries. Somehow, this thing was studying my patients and replicating their conditions with perfect accuracy. I tried calling Dr. Reeves, but he was dealing with an emergency in the ER, a family of 4 who had crashed trying to reach the hospital during the storm. I was on my own with 6 patients, and whatever was lying in bed 7. That's when I started paying closer attention to the anatomy charts on the ICU walls. We had several mounted for reference: skeletal structure, circulatory system, major organs, nervous system pathways. Every time I glanced at the man in bed 7, he seemed to be staring at them with those closed eyes, his head positioned to get the best viewing angle. He was learning, studying human anatomy with the patience and focus of a medical student. But why? Around 2 a.m., I realized I could hear him whispering. Not words exactly, but soft sounds like wind through leaves or water running over stones. When I got close enough to make out what he was saying, my blood went cold. He was reciting medical terminology, anatomical terms, drug names, procedure codes, like he was memorizing a textbook. Epinephrine 1 milligram. Push, he whispered in a voice like rustling paper. Atropine 0.5 milligrams for bradycardia. Morphine 2 to 10 milligrams for pain management. I backed away from the bed, my hands shaking. This wasn't a hypothermia patient. This wasn't human at all. I tried calling security, but Jerry's phone just rang and rang. The storm was getting worse outside, and I could hear tree branches crashing against the building. The emergency lighting flickered occasionally, and the backup generators were running louder now, struggling to maintain power. That's when my other patients started dying. Not all at once, but systematically, one by one. Mr. Henderson's heart rhythm became irregular, then stopped entirely. Mrs. Petty's breathing grew labored, then ceased. The post-surgical patients developed complications that shouldn't have been possible. Their wounds reopened, their blood pressure crashed, their organs began shutting down in sequence. And with each death, the thing in bed 7 grew stronger. His skin gained color, his temperature rose, his impossible heartbeat became more regular and human-like. He was feeding on them, draining their life force by copying their medical conditions and then inverting the process, stealing their vitality to strengthen himself. Around 3 a.m., the last of my real patients died. Mrs. Chen lasted the longest, maybe because she was younger, stronger. But even she couldn't resist whatever this creature was doing to her. I watched her heart monitor flatline while the thing in bed 7 sat up in bed and opened his eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were pale and reflective, like a nocturnal animal's, and they never blinked, never wavered. Just stared at me with ancient intelligence and insatiable hunger. "Thank you for the lesson," he said, in a voice that harmonized with itself, like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. "I have learned much about your medicine." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Some primitive part of my brain recognized that I was being hunted by something far older and more dangerous than anything in my nursing textbooks. "Tell me more," he continued, rising from the bed with movements that were too fluid, too boneless. "Show me how you stop the pain, how you make the dying live again." That's when I saw what he really looked like. Standing upright, he was nearly 8 feet tall, his limbs elongated and wrong. His skin was pale and translucent, showing dark vessels underneath that pulsed with stolen blood. His face was a rough approximation of human features, like something that had learned about anatomy from books but had never seen a living person up close. But it was his hands that terrified me most. They had transformed into surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, syringes, as if he had absorbed every medical tool he'd observed and could reshape his body to recreate them. "I have been learning for so long, pertusite," he said, reaching toward me with fingers that were now razor-sharp bone saws. "Hospitals are such wonderful schools, so much knowledge, so much suffering to study." I backed toward the medication cart, my mind racing. This thing had been infiltrating hospitals for years, maybe decades, learning human medicine, perfecting its mimicry, feeding on patients while it studied our anatomy and our efforts to heal. But I realized something important. If it had spent so much time studying medicine, it must have learned about our weaknesses as well as our strengths. It understood human physiology well enough to know exactly how to kill us, but that also meant it might be vulnerable to the same things that killed humans. I reached the medication cart and grabbed a vial of potassium chloride. In high concentrations, it would stop any heart, human or otherwise. But as I drew it into a syringe, the creature laughed a sound like breaking glass mixed with wind chimes. "I know that medicine," it said. "I know what it does. I have watched your kind use it to stop suffering permanently." It lunged at me with impossible speed, those surgical hands reaching for my throat. I rolled aside, and it crashed into the bank of monitors, sparks flying as the delicate electronics shattered. But instead of screaming in pain, it seemed to absorb the electrical energy, growing brighter and more solid. That's when I understood its weakness. This thing fed on suffering, on life force, on the energy of dying patients. But it also fed on the infrastructure of medicine itself, the equipment, the procedures, the systematic approach to healing. It had become dependent on the very hospitals it infiltrated. I ran to the fire alarm station and smashed the glass with my elbow. The sprinkler system activated immediately, soaking everything in the ICU with pressurized water. But more importantly, the alarm would shut down all non-essential electrical systems to prevent electrocution. The creature shrieked as the water hit its translucent skin, and I watched it begin to dissolve like salt. Not because of the water itself, but because the emergency protocols had cut power to all the medical monitoring equipment it had been feeding on. Without the constant flow of electronic data about human physiology, without the steady hum of machines keeping people alive, it was losing its connection to the medical knowledge it had spent so long accumulating. "No," it wailed, reaching desperately toward the dead monitors. I must learn." But the knowledge was flowing out of it, like blood from a wound. Decades of stolen medical expertise, absorbed from countless hospitals, countless dying patients, draining away as the infrastructure it depended on went dark. I grabbed a crash cart, one of the few pieces of equipment still running on battery power, and rammed it into the creature as hard as I could. It went down in a tangle of impossibly long limbs, its skin now gray and cracking like old parchment. The storm was still raging outside, but I could tell it was weakening. Dawn was coming, and whatever connection this thing had to the December blizzards was fading with the darkness. By the time Dr. Reeves and the emergency team reached the ICU 20 minutes later, there was nothing left but a dark stain on the floor and the lingering smell of wet earth and metal. 6 patients dead from storm-related equipment failures. 6 families who would never know their loved ones had been fed to something ancient and hungry that wore the mask of modern medicine. The official report blamed the deaths on power fluctuations during the storm. The hospital's insurance covered the settlements. I was commended for my heroic efforts to save lives during a crisis, but I knew the truth. I knew that somewhere in these mountains, probably in other hospitals scattered through Appalachia, similar creatures were still learning, still feeding, still perfecting their understanding of human medicine so they could kill more efficiently. I resigned the next day. Couldn't even look at a hospital without having panic attacks. Moved to North Carolina, then Tennessee, then finally settled in Kentucky, selling insurance. Changed my name, my whole life, everything that connected me to that night. But I still monitor the medical news from Appalachian hospitals. Still watch for patterns of unexplained deaths during severe weather. Still check the obituaries when the December storms roll through the mountains. Because I know they're still out there, still learning, still hungry. The thing that haunts me most isn't the creature itself, or even the patients who died. It's the knowledge that these entities have been studying human medicine for generations, accumulating our healing knowledge and using it as a weapon. Every medical breakthrough, every advancement in patient care, every compassionate innovation designed to reduce suffering, they've learned it all and perverted it into new methods of torture. They understand us better than we understand ourselves. They know exactly how long to keep someone alive, exactly how much pain a human body can endure, exactly which medicines to withhold and which to administer to maximize agony. And they're patient. So terrifyingly patient. Content to take decades, learning our medical arts, perfecting their techniques, waiting for the perfect storm to provide cover for their feeding. My therapist thinks I have survivor's guilt, that I'm creating elaborate explanations for what was probably just a tragic coincidence during a natural disaster. She doesn't understand that I'm not struggling with guilt. I'm struggling with knowledge. Knowledge that there are things older than our hospitals that have learned to use our compassion as bait. Things that study our anatomy charts not to heal, but to harm with surgical precision. Things that have turned our most sacred profession, the dedication to preserving life, into a school for perfecting death. The worst part is, I can't warn anyone. Who would believe me? How do you tell a nurse or doctor to watch out for patients whose anatomy doesn't quite look right, whose vital signs defy medical explanation, who seem to be learning rather than healing? How do you explain that our medicines can become weapons in the right hands? That our equipment can be turned against us? That our very expertise can be used to torture us more efficiently than any crude instrument of pain? I tried once, posting anonymously on medical forums about unusual patient presentations during severe weather. I was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a burned-out nurse having a breakdown. One administrator suggested I seek psychiatric help, so I stopped trying to warn people and started watching instead, monitoring, documenting, because someday, when these creatures make a mistake or get too confident, someone will need proof. Someone will need evidence. Someone will need to know that our medical knowledge has been weaponized by things that see human suffering not as something to alleviate, but as something to perfect. Until then, I wait. And I watch the weather reports each December, hoping the storms aren't too severe, praying that whatever still lurks in those mountain hospitals remains dormant. But knowing that every winter storm brings them another opportunity to learn, another chance to feed, another night when the healing arts become instruments of exquisite, educated torture. And there's no medicine for that kind of sickness. My name's Tom Bradley, and I used to be somebody who believed the world made sense. At 33, I'd been working nights as a janitor at Ridgeline Elementary for 8 years, ever since my dad died in the mine collapse of 2015. Yeah, the one that made national news for about a week before everyone forgot about us again. Dad was one of 7 men who went down that day, but only 3 bodies ever came back up. The other 4, including my father, were sealed behind a wall of rock and water that the company decided was too expensive to move. I took the custodial job because I needed work that wouldn't remind me of him every day. No underground, no darkness, no tight spaces. Just me, a school full of kids' artwork on the walls, and the peaceful quiet of night shift solitude. The pay was decent enough to keep my mom in her house up on Copper Ridge, and the work kept my hands busy while my mind tried to forget the sound of that mine siren echoing through the hollow. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what Ridgeline Elementary really is, what it's built on top of, and why December 23rd, 2018 changed everything I thought I knew about what happens to people when they disappear underground. Ridgeline sits in the heart of Beckley County, West Virginia, where every town is built on a graveyard of coal tunnels. The school was constructed in 1923, right after they sealed the Ridgeline mine, following a series of cave-ins that killed dozens of miners between 1918 and 1922. My great-grandfather was one of the lucky ones who got out before the final collapse. But he used to tell stories about the men who didn't. How they'd find evidence that some of them had survived for weeks, maybe months, in the deeper tunnels. Carved messages in the walls, makeshift shelters, tools arranged in ways that suggested someone had been using them long after the official rescue efforts ended. The thing about coal mines in Appalachia is that they're not just holes in the ground. They're entire underground cities, with miles of interconnected tunnels, vast chambers, and shafts that drop deeper than most buildings are tall. When they flood or collapse, they don't just disappear, they become something else. A hidden world beneath our feet, with its own weather, its own ecosystem, its own rules. My first 7 years at Ridgeline, I'd occasionally hear stories from the older maintenance workers about strange sounds in the basement, about sections of the foundation that seemed to shift and settle in ways that didn't make engineering sense. But the building was solid, the basement was dry, and I'd learned to ignore the kind of local folklore that every old building accumulates. Mountain people love their ghost stories, and I'd always figured that's all they were. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. The basement at Ridgeline is laid out like a cross, with the main corridor running east-west under the original building and a shorter north-south corridor that was added when they expanded the school in the 1972. The boiler room sits at the intersection, surrounded by storage rooms, electrical panels, and the water main access. Along the north wall, there's always been a section that looked different from the rest, older brick and mortar, rougher construction. I'd been told it was part of the original mine infrastructure that got incorporated into the school's foundation, sealed up and made safe. What I didn't know was that it had never been properly sealed at all. December 23rd started like any other Sunday night shift. I was looking forward to getting the heating system tuned up before Christmas break, then having a week off to spend with my mom and my sister Sarah, who was driving down from Pittsburgh with her 2 kids. The weather forecast was calling for a major winter storm, the kind that dumps 2 feet of snow and shuts down the whole region for days, but it wasn't supposed to hit until after midnight. I should have paid more attention to that forecast. The first sign that something was wrong came around 8 p.m., when I was working through the second-grade classrooms on the east wing. I heard this faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls, like something with claws was moving around in the space between the rooms. At first, I figured it was mice or rats. Old buildings get them, especially when the temperature drops and they're looking for warmth. But the sound was too organized, too purposeful. It followed a pattern, moving from room to room in a way that suggested intelligence. And it was getting louder. By 9 p.m., when I made my way down to the basement to check the heating system, the storm had started early. I could hear the wind picking up outside, and the first snowflakes were hitting the high windows. My phone showed the storm moving in faster than predicted, but I figured I still had a couple hours before the roads became impassable. That's when I smelled it. This thick, organic odor that I'd never noticed in the basement before, wet earth mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the smell that used to cling to my dad's clothes when he came home from the mine. But underneath that, there was another smell, sweet and rotting, like meat that had been left in a warm, damp place for too long. I followed the smell to the north wall, where I found something that made my blood freeze in my veins. 3 of the bricks in the old sealed section had been removed from the inside, creating an opening about the size of a manhole cover. Behind it, I could see the beginning of a tunnel that stretched back into absolute darkness. The mortar around the removed bricks was scattered on the basement floor, and the edges looked like they'd been clawed away rather than carefully chiseled. I grabbed my industrial flashlight and peered into the opening. The tunnel was definitely old mine construction, rough stone walls supported by rotting timber, with narrow-gauge rail tracks disappearing into the darkness. But there were newer additions too, crude shelters made from scavenged materials, tools that looked like they'd been maintained and sharpened, and along the walls, carved messages in a mixture of English and something else I couldn't read. Cold above, warm below. School empty, winter, children gone. We rise. But it was the last message, carved deeper and more recently than the others, that made me drop my flashlight and stumble backward. Tom Bradley, James Bradley's son. You come. They knew my name, they knew my father's name, and they'd been waiting for me. The flashlight beam danced crazily as I tried to pick it up with shaking hands, and in that wild light, I saw them. Footprints in the tunnel dust that were almost human but wrong in every proportion. Too long, too narrow, with claw marks where toes should be. And they led from deep in the tunnel right up to the basement opening, then spread out across the basement floor in different directions. They'd been coming up, they'd been exploring the school, and judging by the number of different tracks, there were a lot of them. I tried to call my supervisor, but my phone had no signal in the basement. When I ran upstairs to use the landline in the main office, it was dead. Outside, the storm had turned into a full blizzard, with snow falling so heavy I couldn't see the parking lot. My truck was already buried under a foot of snow, and the roads were definitely impassable by now. I was trapped in the school for the night with whatever was living in those tunnels. When I got back to the basement, I found that someone had been messing with the heating system while I was gone. Pipes that had been properly connected were now loose. Valves had been turned to dangerous positions, and there were new scratches on the metal deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws or crude tools. It was sabotage, deliberate, intelligent sabotage designed to disable the heating system right before the worst storm of the year. I spent the next hour trying to repair the damage, But every time I fixed one problem, I'd discover two more. It was like they were watching me, learning how the system worked, then undoing my repairs faster than I could make them. And the whole time, I could hear sounds from the tunnel, not just scratching now, but voices, whispering conversations, in that mixture of English and something else. Around 11 p.m., I decided to do some research. In my supervisor's office, I found a folder of old documents about the school's construction, including the original survey reports from 1923. What I read there changed everything. The Ridgeline mine hadn't been abandoned because of cave-ins. It had been sealed because of the miners themselves. According to the reports, several miners had been trapped in the deeper tunnels during a flood in 1918. When rescue crews finally reached them 6 months later, they found that the men had survived, but they'd changed. The darkness and isolation had done something to them, something that the report described carefully in euphemisms and medical jargon. They'd adapted to living underground. Their eyes had become more sensitive to light, their hearing had sharpened, their bodies had grown thin and elongated from crawling through narrow spaces. And they'd developed what the report called aggressive territorial behaviors and reluctance to return to surface conditions. The company had tried to bring them back up, but the miners had fought violently against rescue. They'd retreated deeper into the mine system, establishing what amounted to an underground colony. The decision was made to seal the mine completely, trapping them inside, rather than risk them escaping into the town above. But seals can be broken, and a century of isolation can turn men into something much worse than animals. The report included a map of the tunnel system, and when I spread it out on the desk, I realized the true scope of what I was dealing with. The mine didn't just extend under the school, it connected to dozens of other sealed mines throughout the region. There was an entire underground network stretching for miles in every direction, with multiple access points that had been forgotten over the decades. They weren't trapped in one place. They were everywhere, moving freely through a hidden world beneath our feet. And now they'd decided to reclaim the surface. As I was studying the map, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the office. Slow, careful footsteps that paused outside the door. I turned off the desk lamp and crept to the window, hoping to see who was there. The figure standing in the hallway was tall and impossibly thin, wearing the tattered remains of old mining clothes. Its back was hunched from years of crawling through low tunnels, and its arms hung almost to its knees. When it turned its head toward my hiding place, its eyes reflected the dim emergency lighting like an animal's, but they were human eyes, intelligent and aware. It smiled with too many teeth and tapped once on the office door with one elongated finger. Then it whispered my name in a voice like grinding coal. "Tom Bradley. James Bradley's boy, we've been waiting." I heard answering calls from other parts of the building. They'd spread throughout the school while I was researching, and they all knew exactly where I was. For the next 3 hours, they hunted me through the building like a pack of wolves. But these weren't mindless predators. They were strategic, coordinated, using their knowledge of the tunnel system to appear wherever I least expected them. When I barricaded myself in the gymnasium, they cut the power to that section. When I tried to reach the kitchen and its exterior loading dock, they were already waiting there. They weren't trying to kill me, I realized. They were hurting me, driving me toward something specific. Back toward the basement, back toward the tunnel opening. Around 3 a.m., when the storm finally started to weaken, I understood what they really wanted. I found my father. He was waiting for me in the basement, standing beside the tunnel opening in the same mining clothes he'd been wearing the day he died. But like the others, he'd been changed by his years underground. His body was stretched and pale, his fingers ended in yellowed claws, and his eyes held a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Tommy," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it, except for the grinding undertone. "I've missed you, son. We all have. We've been alone down there for so long." "You're dead," I whispered. "You died in the mine collapse. I went to your funeral." He laughed, and it sounded like rocks falling down a deep shaft. "Dead? Boy, we're more alive than we ever were on the surface. Down there, you don't need the sun. You don't need the company store or the union bosses or the government men who decide whether you live or die. You just need the darkness and each other." The other figures had gathered behind him now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, filling the basement with their pale faces and hungry eyes. Men who'd been trapped in different mines over different decades, all drawn together by the same terrible adaptation to underground life. The surface world abandoned us, my father continued, sealed us away when we became inconvenient. But we've learned to thrive in the dark, and now it's time to expand. This school is just the beginning. We're going to reclaim what was ours, one building at a time, until the whole region is part of our territory. And you're going to help us, Tommy. You know this building better than anyone. You know the maintenance schedules, the security systems, when people come and go. With your help, we can take this place without anyone on the surface knowing what happened until it's too late. I looked at my father, at the thing that had once been my father, and made the hardest decision of my life. No, I said. His face twisted with rage that was all too human. You don't understand, boy. This isn't a choice. You're coming with us, one way or another. Either as family or as food. That's when I triggered the emergency fire suppression system. I'd been slowly backing toward the manual release while we talked, and when I pulled that lever, every sprinkler in the basement activated at once. But more importantly, the deluge system designed to protect the electrical equipment kicked in, flooding the basement with thousands of gallons of water in less than a minute. The tunnel dwellers screamed as the water hit them, not from pain, but from instinctive terror. They'd spent so long in their carefully controlled underground environment that the sudden flood triggered memories of the disasters that had trapped them in the first place. They fled back toward the tunnel, opening in a panicked mass, pushing and clawing at each other in their desperation to escape. That's when I set off the demolition charges. The school kept emergency explosives for construction work, and I'd learned how to use them during my maintenance training. I placed charges at every tunnel opening I could find, and triggered them remotely from the roof access, bringing down tons of concrete and steel to seal the mine system permanently. The explosions weren't huge, but they were enough. When the emergency responders finally arrived at dawn, they found me on the roof, half frozen and babbling about a gas leak explosion that had flooded and collapsed the basement. The school district bought my story and had the entire basement filled with concrete. The building was condemned for structural damage, and Ridgeline Elementary was permanently closed. But I know the truth. The explosions didn't kill them. They're still down there, sealed behind tons of concrete and rubble, waiting for another way out. And I know that there are other access points, other forgotten mine entrances throughout the region where they might emerge. I quit my job the next week and left West Virginia entirely. I live in Phoenix now, work construction during the day, and spend my nights researching mining records from Appalachian counties. I maintain a website that tracks unusual incidents near old mine sites, missing persons, structural failures, reports of strange sounds from basements and sewers. Because here's what I learned that night. The dead don't always stay buried in coal country. Sometimes they adapt, sometimes they organize, and sometimes they decide that it's time to reclaim what they believe is rightfully theirs. My father and his people are still out there, still planning, still growing their numbers with every person who disappears into the mountains and never comes back out. The December 2018 snowstorm was just their first attempt to expand their territory. It won't be their last. If you live in coal country, if your house or workplace sits on top of old mine workings, pay attention to strange sounds in your basement. Check for loose bricks or stones in foundation walls. And if you ever smell wet earth and rotting meat coming from places where it shouldn't be, don't investigate. Just run. Because once they know you're there, once they decide you'd be useful to their cause, they'll never stop hunting you. And eventually, they always find a way up. Asterisk, editor's note. This account was submitted to our website in January 2019. Ridgeline Elementary School in Beckley County, WV was indeed closed following an unexplained basement explosion on the 24th of December 2018. No fatalities were reported. Tom Bradley's current whereabouts are unknown, but similar stories have been submitted from other former mining communities throughout Appalachia. If you have had similar experiences, please contact us through our secure submission form. I'm 29 years old, and I've lived most of my life thinking I understood what it meant to be alone. After my divorce 3 years ago, I moved up to Pine Ridge, North Carolina, a town so small it barely shows up on most maps. Population 847, nestled in a valley between two ridges that the old-timers say have their own weather patterns, their own moods. I took the overnight shift at Mountain View Grocery because it paid better than day work, and because, after everything that happened in Charlotte, I craved the solitude. What I didn't know then was that in these mountains, especially during the deep winter storms that roll through every December, you're never really alone. The Cherokee who lived here first knew this. They had stories about the winter spirits, about things that wake up when the snow gets deep enough to muffle sound and the wind gets strong enough to carry voices that aren't quite human. The white settlers who came later learned to respect those stories, even if they didn't always believe them. I should have listened to those stories. My name's Lisa Park, and I work the graveyard shift at the only grocery store serving 3 mountain communities: Pine Ridge, Cedar Falls, and Whisper Creek. The store sits at the junction of 2 state roads that wind through the hollows. And during winter, we're often the last place still open when the weather turns bad. People drive 30 minutes on icy roads to stock up on milk and bread before a storm, because once the snow starts in earnest, you might not see a plow for days. The building itself is nothing special. A converted warehouse from the 1972 with concrete floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the kind of industrial heating system that makes everything smell faintly of metal and old air filters. But it's honest work, and after the mess my marriage became, honest work felt like salvation. Dave Morrison, the manager, hired me without many questions. "You show up, you do the job, you don't steal from the register," he'd said. "That puts you ahead of half the applicants." For 3 years, I'd settled into a routine that felt as comfortable as old clothes. Clock in at 11 p.m., process the day's deliveries, stock the shelves, handle the occasional late-night customer. The regulars became familiar. Old Pete Hendricks picking up his heart medication, Jenny Walsh grabbing coffee after her shift at the truck stop diner, the long-haul drivers stopping for energy drinks and cigarettes before tackling the mountain passes. Normal people living normal lives, just on a schedule that kept them awake while the rest of the world slept. Working nights in a place like Pine Ridge, you get attuned to the rhythms of the mountains in a way day people never do. You learn the difference between the sound of wind through bare December trees and the whistle of air moving through the gaps in the ridgelines. You know which nights the temperature will drop 20 degrees in an hour, and which storms will peter out before dawn versus the ones that will bury the valley for days. December 24th, 2023. Started like most winter nights. The Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning for the western North Carolina mountains, but we got those every couple weeks during the season. Dave left early, around 8 p.m., to get home to his family. His youngest was 7, still young enough to believe in Santa, and Dave never missed the Christmas Eve ritual of putting out cookies and milk. "You sure you're okay handling things solo if this storm hits hard?" he'd asked, handing me the keys and the alarm codes. "I've done it before," I reminded him. "Go home to your family." The first customers of the evening were exactly what I expected. Families grabbing last-minute items for Christmas morning, elderly folks picking up prescriptions, a young couple buying wine for a Christmas Eve dinner. Everyone was in good spirits, wishing each other Merry Christmas, talking about the storm with that mixture of excitement and concern that mountain people have about big weather. By 10 p.m., the snow had started. Big, wet flakes that stuck to the windows and began accumulating on the cars in the parking lot. The wind was picking up too, making that low moaning sound as it pushed around the building's corners. I turned up the radio in the back office to drown out the noise and settled in for what I expected would be a quiet night once the weather got too bad for casual driving. The Appalachian Mountains have their own microclimate systems, something about the way the ridges channel air currents and trap weather systems. What the meteorologists predicted as a moderate snowfall became something much more serious by 11 p.m. The wind shifted from the northwest, bringing with it the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache and snow that fell so thick it looked like television static against the parking lot lights. I was stalking the canned goods aisle when the lights flickered for the first time. Not unusual. The power lines up here are old, and ice buildup on the cables causes problems. But the backup generator kicked in smoothly, just like it was supposed to. Dave had spent good money on that system after the ice storm of 2019 left us without power for 6 days. That's when I heard the front doors chime. 1:15 a.m. is late for a customer, especially in weather like this, but not unprecedented. Sometimes people realize they've forgotten something essential and brave the roads to get it. I called out my usual greeting. "We're open, just holler if you need anything," and continued working, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of someone moving through the store with purpose. Instead, I heard something that made my skin prickle. Footsteps that moved without rhythm, stopping and starting at irregular intervals, like someone who was lost or confused about where they were going. I wheeled my stocking cart to the end of aisle 7 and looked toward the front of the store. There was a man standing, motionless in the produce section, his back to me. Tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a dark winter coat that looked expensive, the kind of heavy wool peacoat you'd buy in a city, not the practical hunting jackets most locals wore. His posture was wrong somehow, too straight, like a soldier at attention. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, pushing my cart closer. He turned around with deliberate slowness, and that's when I got my first good look at him. White male, probably mid-40s, with dark hair that was perfectly styled despite the storm outside. His face was symmetrical in a way that was almost unsettling. No scars, no asymmetries, no character lines. Like a composite sketch of what an attractive middle-aged man should look like, but without any of the small imperfections that make faces memorable. "Just looking," he said, and his voice had that same too-perfect quality as his appearance. No regional accent, no speech patterns that would place him anywhere specific. Generic American English, the kind you hear in commercials. I nodded and went back to my work, but something about the encounter bothered me. In 3 years of working nights, you develop instincts about people. You learn to spot the customers who might cause problems, the ones who are drunk or high or just looking for trouble. This man didn't fit any of those categories, but every alarm bell in my head was ringing softly. He moved through the store with purpose, but not the purpose of shopping. He would pick up items, a box of cereal, a jar of peanut butter, a package of paper towels, examine them for several seconds, then replace them exactly where he'd found them. And he was watching me. Not constantly, but whenever I glanced in his direction, I would catch him staring before he'd look away. The storm outside was intensifying. Through the big front windows, I could see that the snow was falling so heavily that the parking lot lights created only small pools of visibility in what was otherwise a white void. The wind was making sounds I'd never heard before. Not just the usual whistle and moan, but something that almost sounded like voices calling from a great distance. That's when I noticed the first real wrongness about my customer. His clothes weren't wet. He'd come in during a blizzard, but his coat showed no signs of snow or moisture. His hair was perfectly dry. His shoes, expensive leather dress shoes, completely inappropriate for mountain winter weather, showed no signs of snow or salt stains. It was like he'd materialized inside the store rather than walking through a snowstorm to get here. I was processing this observation when he spoke again, and my blood went cold. "Getting pretty nasty out there," he said, using my exact words from earlier, my exact vocal inflection. Not similar to how I'd spoken, identical. I turned to face him directly, and that's when I saw the wrongness in his proportions. His arms hung too long at his sides, his fingers extending past where they should have ended. When he smiled, that same generic, pleasant expression, I counted his teeth. There were too many of them, and they were too white, too sharp, like someone had designed a mouth for maximum efficiency rather than human function. "Yeah," I managed to say. "Roads must be getting bad." "Roads must be getting bad," he echoed, and again it was my voice, my words, but coming from his throat. I backed away, my heart starting to race. This wasn't echolalia or some kind of neurological condition. This was something else entirely. "I need to finish my stocking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned away and pushed my cart toward the dairy section, but I could feel him following me. When I stopped to place milk cartons on the shelf, he stopped. When I moved to the next section, he moved. And gradually, I became aware that he wasn't just following me, he was mimicking my movements, like a mirror with a slight delay. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of dimness, I caught a glimpse of his shadow on the wall. It didn't match his body. The shadow was longer, more angular, with appendages that his physical form didn't possess. I tried to focus on my work, but my hands were shaking. The canned goods rattled against each other as I placed them on the shelves. Behind me, I could hear him breathing, but the rhythm was wrong. Too deep, too slow, like lungs that were larger than they should be. "Lisa," he said, and hearing my name in my own voice made my knees weak. Lisa Park, 29 years old, divorced. Moved here from Charlotte 3 years ago, after everything fell apart. I spun around to face him. He was closer now, maybe 8 feet away, and the resemblance to me was unmistakable. His hair had lightened to match mine, his facial structure had shifted to become more angular, more feminine. He was still clearly male, still wearing that expensive coat, but it was like looking at a masculine version of myself. "How do you know that?" I whispered. His smile widened, showing those 2 numerous teeth. "I know you live in the little blue house on Maple Street with the broken porch light you keep meaning to fix. I know you call your sister in Oregon every Sunday and pretend you're happy here. I know you lie awake sometimes, wondering if leaving Charlotte was running away or moving forward." These were things I'd never told anyone, private thoughts, personal fears that lived only in my head. "I know you're afraid of being alone forever," he continued, taking another step closer. "I know you still wear your wedding ring sometimes when you're home alone, just to remember what it felt like to belong to someone." My hand instinctively went to my ring finger, where I could still feel the faint indentation from 7 years of marriage. "What are you?" I asked. He tilted his head, considering the question with genuine curiosity. The movement was too fluid, like his neck had more vertebrae than it should. "I'm what happens when the storms get deep enough," he said. "When the snow gets thick enough to muffle the sound of the real world, and the wind gets strong enough to carry the old voices. Your people, the Cherokee, they knew about us. They called us the winter hungry, the shape takers who feed on identity." He moved closer, and I could smell something wrong about him. Not decay exactly, but something organic and earthy, like wet soil and moss. Like something that had been buried and recently dug up. Every December, when the big storms come, we wake up. We look for people who are isolated, alone, vulnerable. People like you, Lisa. People who work nights, who've separated themselves from the herd. People who wouldn't be missed right away. I backed against the dairy case, trapped by the refrigerated units. The cold seeped through my work shirt, but I was already shivering from fear. "The beautiful thing about your generation," he continued, "is how much information you leave lying around. Social media, public records, work schedules. I've been watching you for weeks, learning your patterns, your habits, your fears. I know you better than you know yourself." Then he did something that made my sanity slip a notch. He began to change. The transformation wasn't gradual this time. His face shifted like clay being molded by invisible hands. His bone structure rearranged itself, his skin tone adjusted, his hair grew and changed color. In the space of 30 seconds, he became an exact duplicate of me. Not just resembling me, but perfectly identical. Down to the small scar on my left hand and the way my work shirt had a small coffee stain on the front pocket. When he spoke again, it was with my voice, my speech patterns, but expressing thoughts that weren't mine. "The storm is perfect tonight," he said. "Deep enough, strong enough, isolated enough. No one can get in, no one can get out. Just you and me, Lisa. Just us." I ducked under his arm and ran. Behind me, I heard him laugh. And it was my laugh, but delighted in a way I'd never sounded. Predatory and hungry. The store suddenly felt enormous, like a maze designed to trap rather than serve customers. The familiar aisles seemed to stretch endlessly under the flickering fluorescent lights. I ran toward the office, toward the landline phone, but I could hear him behind me, moving with inhuman speed and making sounds that weren't quite footsteps. "You can't call anyone," he called out, his voice, my voice, echoing through the store. "Phone lines are down. Roads are impassable. And even if you could reach someone, who would they believe? The Lisa Park they know, or some hysterical woman claiming to be Lisa Park?" I burst into the office and slammed the door, immediately pushing the filing cabinet against it as a barricade. The landline was dead when I picked it up. No dial tone, just empty static that sounded almost like whispers. From outside the office, I heard scratching sounds, like fingernails on metal, but too loud and too sharp to be human nails. Between the scratching, I could hear breathing that was too deep, too wet, like something with lungs full of fluid. "I've been planning this for months," came my voice through the door. "Learning you, studying you, understanding every detail of your life. I know how you take your coffee. 2 sugars, no cream. I know you bite your lower lip when you're concentrating. I know you have nightmares about your ex-husband finding you here. I looked down at my lip. I had been biting it. I know about the pills you take to sleep and the ones you take to wake up. I know about the journal you keep hidden under your mattress, where you write letters to the daughter you lost in the miscarriage. My knees gave out. I'd never told anyone about the miscarriage, not even my sister. It was the real reason my marriage fell apart, the grief that Charlotte couldn't contain. I know you better than you know yourself, the voice continued, and soon I'll be you better than you ever were. The scratching intensified, and I realized he was trying to claw through the door. The metal was groaning under the pressure, and I could see thin cuts appearing in the steel. I looked around desperately for a weapon, for an escape, for anything. The office had no windows, no other exits. But there were cleaning supplies, industrial chemicals that we used for deep cleaning. I grabbed the bottles and started mixing them, creating a toxic cloud that filled the small room. The chemical smell was overwhelming, burning my eyes and throat, but I heard the scratching stop, then silence that was somehow worse than the noise. I waited, hardly breathing, listening for any sound that would tell me where he was or what he was planning. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and I could hear something that might have been wind or might have been voices calling my name. Then, through the door, I heard my own voice again, but different now, uncertain. "Lisa, please," it said. "I'm getting weaker. The storm, I can't maintain." The voice was breaking apart, becoming less human. I heard sounds I couldn't identify, clicking, scraping, something like static electricity. That's when I understood. He was tied to the storm somehow, drew power from it. And storms, even the worst ones, eventually end. I waited in that chemical-filled room for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds outside change. The scratching stopped. The breathing stopped. Eventually, even the wind began to die down. By 4 a.m., I could see the first hint of dawn through the gap under the door. Not sunlight, but the subtle lessening of darkness that comes before sunrise. And from somewhere in the store, I heard footsteps running toward the front entrance. I waited another hour before I dared to move the filing cabinet and open the door. The store was empty. The front doors were standing open, cold air and melting snow blowing across the entrance. In the slush by the doors, there were footprints that started out human but gradually became something else, longer, with claw marks instead of toe impressions, eventually disappearing entirely as if whatever made them had simply stopped existing. Dave found me there when he came in the next morning. I was sitting behind the customer service counter, still holding a bottle of industrial bleach, staring at the melting footprints. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to me. The police wrote it up as a break-in, someone looking for drugs or money, probably spooked by the storm and scared off when the weather got too bad. The security cameras had malfunctioned. They showed normal footage until midnight, then nothing but static until dawn. But here's what the official report didn't mention. When they reviewed the earlier footage, they found something that made the investigating officer close the case without further questions. At 11:30 p.m., the cameras clearly showed me stocking shelves. But at 11:35, they showed two identical figures in the store. Both wearing my clothes, both moving with my mannerisms, both looking exactly like me. The officer who saw that footage transferred to a different department the next week. He wouldn't talk about what else might have been on those tapes. I quit my job and left Pine Ridge that same day. Packed everything I owned into my car and drove straight to my sister's place in Oregon. Didn't stop except for gas and coffee. I couldn't stay in those mountains, couldn't risk another December storm. But leaving didn't solve the problem. 3 months later, my sister casually mentioned that someone had called asking about me, a woman who sounded exactly like me, claiming to be Lisa Park, asking detailed questions about my childhood, my habits, my plans. When my sister asked why I was calling myself, the woman hung up. 6 months after that, I got a call from Dave Morrison. Someone had applied for a job at Mountain View Grocery, he said, used my name, my social security number, had all my work history and references. But when he met with her for an interview, something felt wrong. She looked exactly like me, sounded like me, even had the same mannerisms. But she didn't remember working there, didn't remember him. Asked questions about the job like she'd never seen the inside of the store. "Lisa," Dave said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you have a twin sister? Someone who might be using your identity?" I told him no, and after a long pause, he said, "I was afraid you'd say that." The application disappeared from his files that night. Security cameras showed someone who looked exactly like me entering the store after closing time, but the person on the footage moved wrong, walked wrong, like they were remembering how to be human rather than actually being human. That was 2 years ago. Since then, there have been other incidents. My credit report shows inquiries from banks I've never contacted. My driver's license has been flagged for suspicious activity. Apparently, someone matching my description and using my information has been pulled over in 3 different states, but the fingerprints never match the ones on file. Last month, my sister called to tell me she'd seen me on the local news in Portland, a woman who looked exactly like me giving an interview about surviving a car accident. But I've never been in a car accident in Oregon, and when my sister tried to contact the news station, they had no record of the interview. I've started checking mirrors obsessively, looking for something that might not be quite right in my reflection. I've started paying attention to my shadow, making sure it moves when I move and stops when I stop. And every December, when the first snow starts to fall, I make sure I'm somewhere warm, somewhere public, somewhere with lots of people around. Because I think it's still out there. Still learning to be me, still getting better at it with each attempt. And I think every winter storm gives it another chance to feed, to grow stronger, to become more perfect in its imitation. The Cherokee had stories about the winter hungry, but they also had protections against them. Rituals and ceremonies that could bind the shape takers, keep them sleeping through the storm season. But the knowledge is mostly lost now, passed down through families that have scattered to the 4 winds or forgotten the old ways entirely. Sometimes I wonder if that's why it's getting stronger, why there are more sightings, more incidents, more people reporting encounters with things that wear familiar faces but move with unfamiliar purposes. Maybe the winter hungry have been waiting for us to forget how to protect ourselves. Maybe they've been waiting for a generation that shares everything about themselves online, that documents every detail of their lives on social media, that makes the process of learning to be someone else as simple as reading their digital footprints. I don't work nights anymore. I don't live alone. I don't go anywhere isolated during winter months. And I never, ever go back to the mountains when there's snow in the forecast. But I have dreams sometimes about that Christmas Eve, about what might have happened if the storm had lasted longer, if dawn hadn't come when it did. In my dreams, I see 2 identical figures walking out of Mountain View Grocery into the snowy dawn. And I can never tell which one is real and which one is the copy that got good enough to fool itself. In my dreams, I'm never sure which one I am. And in December, when the snow gets deep in the Appalachian Mountains and the wind carries voices that might not be entirely human, I sometimes catch myself checking my reflection and wondering if the face looking back at me is really mine. Or if somewhere out there, in a little blue house with a broken porch light, something that used to be the winter hungry is living my old life better than I ever did. The mountains remember everything, my Cherokee friends tell me. The storms carry more than snow. And some hungers never really end, they just learn to wait.